For years, this was the largest abandoned building on Earth, 3.5 million square feet of it, on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit. The windows are gone, the roofs have collapsed into the floors, trees, actual full-grown trees, are pushing up through what used to be assembly lines. Graffiti covers every reachable surface, and above you, in fading paint on a crumbling parapet, you can still just make out a single word: Packard. Photographers flew in from other countries just to shoot it. It became the single most recognizable image of Detroit's collapse, a shorthand you've probably seen 100 times without knowing its name, the backdrop for every documentary about the death of American industry. But here's what almost none of those photographers understood as they picked their way through the rubble. This wasn't just a factory. This building was, in its day, the most advanced manufacturing facility on the face of the earth. It didn't just make cars. It invented the way the modern world builds factories, and the company that operated here didn't make ordinary cars. It made the finest automobiles this country has ever produced, cars for presidents and kings, cars so well built they eventually became a problem. So how does something like that happen? How do you go from the most modern factory in the world to the most famous ruin in the world? The answer is stranger and more human than simple decline, and once you see how it happened, you'll never look at that word on the parapet the same way again. Let's go back to the beginning. And the beginning starts, of all places, with a complaint. In 1898, a mechanical engineer named James Ward Packard bought himself an automobile. It was made by a man named Alexander Winton, one of the early American car builders, and the car was, by most accounts, a lemon that broke down constantly and frustrated him to no end. So Packard did what an engineer does. He went back to Winton and told him, in so many words, that the car could be built better. And Winton, insulted, threw down a challenge. If Packard thought he could build a better automobile, he should go do it himself. That's the legend, anyway. And whether every detail is exactly right, we know what happened next. James Ward Packard and his brother William, working in Warren, Ohio, built their first car in 1899, a single-cylinder machine that ran better than what they'd been sold. And almost immediately, the Packard name came to stand for something specific in American life: quality. Not speed, not novelty, not cheapness, quality. There's a story about how the company got its famous slogan, and it captures everything about what Packard was. Sometime around 1901, a potential buyer from Pittsburgh wrote in asking for details about the car, what its features were, why he should buy one, and James Ward Packard, according to the legend, told his secretary how to reply. "Tell him," he said, "to ask the man who owns one. Ask the man who owns one." Think about the confidence in that. We're not going to sell you with a brochure. We're not going to list our features. Go find someone who already owns a Packard. Ask them, and their answer will be all the advertisement we need. That slogan became one of the most famous in American history, and it worked because it was true. Packard built cars that turned their owners into evangelists. By 1903, the operation had outgrown Ohio, and a group of Detroit investors convinced the Packards to move to the city that was becoming the beating heart of the American automobile. And there, on 40 acres along East Grand Boulevard, Packard hired an architect who would change not just this company, but the entire industrial world. His name was Albert Kahn. Now, you need to understand what factories were like before Albert Kahn, because it's the key to this whole story. In 1903, a factory was a dark, cramped, dangerous place. They were built of brick and timber, with small windows and heavy walls that had to hold up the whole structure. The interiors were dim, the spaces were tight, and because they were full of wood, they burned. Factory fires were a constant terror of the industrial age. Kahn's first buildings for Packard, the first 9 of them, were exactly that traditional kind: brick and timber, cramped, dim, and flammable. But when it came time to build the 10th building, Kahn did something revolutionary, and he did it with his brother. Albert was the architect. His brother Julius was an engineer, a University of Michigan graduate who had been experimenting with a new material, reinforced concrete strengthened from within by steel bars. Together, for Packard's 10th building, The Kahn brothers created something the American auto industry had never seen, a factory made of reinforced concrete. And this changed everything. Because concrete reinforced with steel could carry the weight of the building on a skeleton of columns, the walls no longer had to be thick and load-bearing. That meant the walls could be made of glass, enormous windows. Kahn built what came to be called a daylight factory, a building flooded with natural light, with wide-open interior spaces unbroken by the forest of support walls that older factories needed. The result was brighter and safer, and it didn't burn. And the open floors meant you could lay out an assembly line however you wanted. This was the template for the modern factory. Every giant, light-filled, concrete industrial building you have ever seen descends from what Albert Kahn did on East Grand Boulevard for Packard. Kahn went on to become the most important industrial architect in the world, the man who designed the factories that built America's cars and, later, the tanks and planes that won a war. And it started here. The Packard plant wasn't just modern, it was the birthplace of modern, and the plant kept growing. 10 buildings became dozens. Eventually, the complex sprawled across some 80 buildings and 3.5 million square feet. At its peak, more than 40,000 people worked here. This wasn't a factory anymore. It was an industrial city, humming day and night, and out of its doors rolled the finest cars in America, and they truly were the finest. In 1916, Packard released the Twin Six with a revolutionary 12-cylinder engine, and with it Packard established itself as the undisputed leader of American luxury automobiles. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, a Packard was the car you bought when you had truly arrived. These were cars for the elite of the elite. Packard sold in 61 countries. In 1930, Packard sold nearly twice as many cars abroad as any other maker priced above $2,000. In 1931, 10 Packards were owned by the royal family of Japan. This was an American company building automobiles that the aristocracy of the entire world wanted to be seen in. And when the country went to war, Packard's engineering turned to the war effort, the way the greatest American manufacturers always did. In 1942, Packard converted almost entirely to war production, and what they built is one of the great untold stories of the Second World War. Packard licensed the legendary Merlin engine from Britain's Rolls-Royce, and then did something remarkable. They didn't just copy it, they simplified it, improved it for mass production, and built it by the tens of thousands. The Packard-built Merlin went into the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that GIs called the Cadillac of the skies, one of the finest aircraft of the entire war. Packard engines helped win control of the skies over Europe, and they didn't stop at aircraft. Packard also built enormous 12-cylinder marine engines, and these powered the American PT boats that fought across the Pacific. Each PT boat used 3 Packard engines, so think about the reach of this one company for a moment. The same firm that built limousines for the royal family of Japan was now building the engines that powered the boats and planes fighting against Japan. That is how central Packard was to American industrial might. When the nation needed the best, it came here, to East Grand Boulevard. So Packard emerged from the war with its prestige at an absolute peak. Its engineering was legendary, its name meant quality the world over, and its factory was the birthplace of modern industry. By every measure that should matter, this was one of the strongest companies in America, and within roughly a decade, it would be dead. So what happened? This is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because Packard wasn't killed by a single catastrophe. It was killed by a series of decisions and circumstances that, one at a time, each seemed reasonable, and together added up to the destruction of one of the great names in American history. The first problem is almost unbelievable. Packard's cars were too good. They were built so well, engineered so carefully, that they lasted for decades. And a car that lasts for decades is a car whose owner doesn't come back to buy another one for a very long time. Packard had spent 40 years building a reputation for cars that never wore out, and that reputation quietly became a trap. The company had far fewer repeat customers than a business needs to keep its factory running, because it had done its job too well. The second problem was the luxury market itself. In the years right after the war, America was booming, and everyone wanted a new car. But there was a shortage of raw materials, and demand for pure luxury vehicles, the kind of cars Packard had built its name on, began to soften. The very top of the market was thinning out, and here Packard made the decision that, in hindsight, may have been the beginning of the end, even though it looked like survival at the time. To keep the factory busy and the money coming in, Packard leaned into building lower-priced cars. The strategy had actually started back in 1935, when Packard introduced a more affordable model called the 120 to survive the Great Depression. It worked, in the sense that it sold, but it came at a cost you can't see on a balance sheet. Every time an ordinary person could buy a Packard, the name meant a little bit less to the wealthy buyer who had always defined it. The magic of "ask the man who owns one" depended on the man who owned one being somebody special. When Packards became common, the aura that made them worth their premium price began to fade. Packard was eroding the one thing that made it Packard. By the early 1950s, Packard was caught in a vice. The independent car companies, the ones that weren't part of the giants of Detroit, were all struggling against the sheer scale of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. Those giants could spend more, build more, and sell cheaper than any independent could match. And a man named George Mason, the head of Nash, had a vision to save them all. He believed the independents needed to merge together into one company large enough to survive against the Big Three. So in 1954, Packard made its fateful move. It merged with the Studebaker Corporation, the storied old maker out of South Bend, Indiana, to form the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. On paper, two proud old companies joining forces to survive. In reality, it was two drowning swimmers grabbing onto each other, because what Packard's executives discovered, after the merger was done, was that Studebaker was in far worse shape than anyone had admitted. Studebaker's costs were bloated, its finances were a mess, and it needed to sell an enormous number of cars just to break even, far more than it was actually selling. Packard had not found a life raft. It had chained itself to an anchor. The merged company never turned a profit, not once. And now the story comes back to this building, to East Grand Boulevard, because this is where it ends. As the merged company bled money, production was consolidated, and Detroit lost. The last true Packard built in this plant rolled off the line in 1956. Production of the name limped on for 2 more years, built on Studebaker's lines in South Bend, cars that purists say were Packards in name only. And in 1958, the Packard name, one of the most respected in the history of the automobile, was discontinued forever. 59 years after two brothers built a better car to answer an insult, it was over. But the building didn't come down. That's the strange, haunting part. The company died in the 1950s, but the palace it left behind stood for another 60 years, and what happened to it in those decades is its own kind of tragedy. After the last Packard, the plant didn't just get bulldozed, it lingered. Other businesses moved into the vast complex. It was used for storage, for small manufacturing, for tenants who occupied a corner of a building here or there, while the rest sat empty. For decades, the Packard plant existed in a strange limbo, not quite alive, not quite dead, a giant slowly emptying out. Various tenants operated in parts of it all the way into the late 1990s. And then, in 1999, the situation collapsed into something almost absurd. The city of Detroit, believing it owned the property, evicted the remaining tenants to prepare the site for demolition. But then a legal battle erupted over who actually owned the plant, and the city lost. The title to the largest industrial complex in the area was suddenly in question, and with the tenants gone and the ownership tangled in court, the building was left with no one to protect it. And that is the moment the real ruin began, because an empty building in a struggling city does not simply wait quietly. Scrappers moved in, tearing out anything made of metal, copper wiring, steel beams, pipe, anything they could sell. Vandals followed, then arsonists. Fires broke out in building after building. The roofs, no longer maintained, let in the rain and the snow, and Michigan winters went to work on the concrete, freezing and cracking it season after season. Trees took root in the upper floors. The daylight factory that Albert Kahn had made to flood with sunlight now stood open to the sky because its roofs had fallen in, and this is when the Packard plant became famous a second time, but for the opposite reason. In its first life, it was famous as the pinnacle of modern industry. In its second life, it became the most photographed ruin in America, the definitive image of what people started calling the ruins of Detroit. Photographers came from around the world to document its decay. It appeared in music videos and films and endless magazine spreads about the fall of the American city. 3.5 million square feet of collapsing concrete became a symbol, and most of the people photographing it had no idea that they were standing inside the birthplace of the modern factory, the place that built the engines that won a war. There were dreams of saving it, and the biggest of them belongs to a man named Fernando Palazuelo. In 2013, this Peruvian developer walked through the ruins and saw something almost nobody else did: a future. He bought the majority of the Packard site at a Wayne County tax foreclosure auction for a stunningly low price, just $405,000, for what had once been the most advanced factory on Earth. And his vision was enormous. He announced a $350 million plan to unfold over 15 years that would transform the decaying complex into a whole mini-city of apartments, shops, restaurants, offices, and art galleries. He presented renderings, gave tours to the press, and talked about eventually living in the plant himself. None of it happened. The scope was staggering, the financing never fully came together, and the site had problems you couldn't renovate away. Decades of heavy industry had left the soil contaminated, arsenic and other toxins soaked into the ground, and cleaning it could cost a fortune on its own. Year after year passed with renderings but no real construction. In early 2019, a pedestrian bridge that crossed East Grand Boulevard, one of the plant's most photographed features, simply collapsed into the street. The grand plan quietly died. And eventually the city of Detroit had had enough of the danger, the fires, and the risk of collapse onto the surrounding neighborhood. Beginning in 2022, the wrecking crews finally arrived in earnest. Funded in part by federal pandemic relief money, the city began demolishing the ruins of the Packard plant, building by building, clearing away the most dangerous structures. Over the next 2 years, the majority of that 3.5 million square feet came down. By the end of 2024, the largest abandoned industrial site in the world was, for the most part, simply gone. But not entirely. In a decision that says something quietly moving about how we finally chose to remember this place, the city made a last-minute choice to preserve the iconic administration buildings, the grand original offices that faced the boulevard. And so, as the great complex was leveled around them, those few structures were spared, left standing as almost the last surviving piece of what Packard built here. So walk back with me to where we started, to East Grand Boulevard, and look at what remains. For most of a century, that word on the parapet, Packard, looked down over an industrial cathedral, then over a slowly emptying shell, then over the most famous ruin in America, and finally over the wrecking crews clearing it all away. And here's the thing you should carry away from all of it. The official story of the Packard plant is a story about Detroit's decline, about a Rust Belt city that couldn't hold on to its industry. That's the version most of those photographers thought they were documenting. But the real story is stranger and sadder and more human than that. This was not just any factory. It was the place that taught the world how to build factories, the company that built cars for kings and engines that won a war. It was killed not by some grand historical force, but by its own excellence, cars too good to need replacing, a name too precious to cheapen, and cheapened anyway, and one desperate merger that chained a proud company to a sinking one. The palace didn't have to rot. Someone, at every step, chose the road that led here. And the most haunting part is that the concrete Albert Kahn poured more than 100 years ago, the reinforced concrete that started a revolution, proved so strong that even after decades of fire and frost and neglect, the wreckers had to fight to bring it down. The building was built to last forever. It was the company inside it that couldn't. That word is nearly gone from the parapet now. But for a while there, it was the most important name in the industrial world. Ask the man who owned one, if you can still find him.